And let's now talk about the war in Ukraine. So far, the focus this week was on all that's happening in Moscow. The Chinese leader Xi Jinping was in the city, meeting and greeting the Russian President Vladimir Putin. The two held multiple rounds of talks. They held a joint press conference, issued a joint statement. The world watched their bonhomie in the backdrop of the Ukraine war. But Xi Jinping has now left Moscow, and with him the spotlight also has moved away from the city. You see, all eyes are now on Japan, which will soon be hosting a summit of the G7 leaders. And will this summit be the platform that provides an alternative position on the war? After all, Moscow was all about Xi-Putin bonhomie. Will the G7 be all about Putin bashing?
The world was astonished to see innocent civilians in Bucha killed 1 year ago. As I step on the ground of Bucha today, I really feel great anger for all the atrocious acts.
Many were taken by surprise when the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida decided to travel to Ukraine earlier this week. One moment he was holding talks with his Indian counterpart, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and the next moment Kishida is on a flight followed by a train to Kiev. Was the trip as impromptu as Japan would have you believe? Or was it pre-planned after all? If so, why did Kishida decide to go via India? Are there some dots we are supposed to connect here? You know, India and Japan are Quad partners. Japan is this year's G7 president, and India is the sitting president of the Group of 20. So when the leaders of these two countries, India and Japan, met in New Delhi earlier this week, did they happen to discuss Ukraine and what it means for the G7 and G20, and how the two groupings can try to have solution-oriented discussions during the upcoming summits? Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be attending the G7 summit this year. So will Australia, the other Quad partner, also Vietnam and Indonesia, countries that have territorial disputes with China. My point is, while Xi and Putin were grabbing headlines in Moscow, was there a strategic play in New Delhi that most headlines failed to pick? Because what else explains Kishida's interestingly timed visit to Kiev following his state visit to India? What explains the Delhi factor? Is it a coincidence, or is there more to this? Because a few months from now, when Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK and the US meet for the G7 summit, the club of Western allies will be looking for an opportunity to bash Vladimir Putin, perhaps China as well, for coming up with a peace plan whose clauses the West finds unacceptable. The Western allies will make it a point to use the G7 podium to tell the world that aggression will not be accepted and cannot be rewarded. These G7 leaders will be joined by the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky.
Of course, we discussed our cooperation within the framework of Japan being chair of the G7. Prime Minister Kishida invited me today to take part in the G7 summit that is planned for May in Hiroshima. I accepted the invitation to take part virtually.
So if you thought what happened in Moscow was a defining moment in the war, Kishida's visit to Kiev set in motion a trailer for the next big event in what's becoming a never-ending Ukraine war. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the updates on the move.